I also want to live in a universe where Pretty Cure still went like 15 years or whatever it's been, but it's just been Natalie and Hannah the whole time, and they've like anchored the show the whole way through. I think that would be really cool.
And they pull like a lyrical Nanoha, and they're adults now, and
yeah,
they're still
like they even ate, like if they did like a Steven Universe thing where they like gradually age throughout the seasons and stuff.
Yeah.
And then, my character like has a side thing where he like opens up like some sort of sports store or something, and he goes through like crippling depression and bankruptcy, but then he like turns it around because he invests in stocks. Like that would be really, I think kids would be into that. So
I'd totally watch, like unironically, I would watch that. Like just saying.
So Toei, if you're listening, can you just do a spin-off of Sean Ferguson? Just call it Sean Ferguson. Even in Japan, just forget the show.
No. It's gotta be like
Fujimura. Or call it.
It's gotta be like
FujiP. Or call it Fergie.
Yeah, FujiP with an exclamation mark at the end.
Yeah.
Call it Fergie P, but with no context of what the P means. And then don't hire me to do it though. I just want to watch it. I don't want to be in it.
Hey everyone, welcome to zannencanada. I'm your host Jesse Betteridge. So this podcast is an exploration of the connections between anime and Canadian media, and this episode is a retrospective on an anime series that has had some kind of unique cultural significance in Canada, and we're going to be talking about Pretty Cure, specifically the original Pretty Cure series, Futari wa Pretty Cure, which aired on YTV back in 2009. So usually we talk about shows that had a major impact or were really popular. Pretty Cure is a little different because it is generally perceived as kind of a failure or something that didn't have an impact in Canada. Whether or not this is really truly the case, I don't know. I guess we'll kind of explore that through the episode. I have done a little poking around though, and I was surprised to discover that there's a possibility that Pretty Cure was not a failure in Japan. I am being facetious, of course. It is one of the most profitable franchises on Earth. I think it's worth over $7 billion from what I checked. It's a sandwich in between Sonic the Hedgehog and Candy Crush, which is not a bad place to be. Joining me for this episode are some well-qualified people to help me explore the world of Pretty Cure. And if you listen to the show a lot, you should be familiar with Eryn Dearden, who's been on a number of times before. Eryn, can you just introduce yourself quickly?
Hi there, it's good to be back as always. If for some reason this is your first episode of zannencanada that you're listening to, my name is Eryn, also known as Eryn Cerise. I have a series on YouTube called Mahou Profile, A History of Magical Girls, where I go through the history of magical girls, one show at a time from the very beginning of the genre in the 1960s going forward. It's kind of on hiatus at the moment, but I'm still actively working on it. The current video is just taking a really long time because there's a lot to say about Cutie Honey. And of course, my magical girl knowledge does extend to Pretty Cure as well.
It would have to, because it's really the only magical girl show, right? At least the only magical girl show that's actually targeted at children. The rest seem to...
There's definitely other ones, but Pretty Cure is certainly the juggernaut at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Also joining us is Pike, another Super Cure Pretty fan. Another Pretty Cure super fan. Pike, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I go by Pike online. By day, I work in a microbiology lab, which is pretty neat, and by night, I freak out about Pretty Cure in general. Specifically, the first season, Futari wa Pretty Cure, which we'll be talking about, is my absolute favorite. I just find it to be very special to me for various reasons, which I'll probably get into later. And there's just something about it that really stands out to me more than any of the other seasons, or any anime, really. I would easily call this my favorite anime of all time, not just my favorite Precure season. And I love talking about it, so I'm very glad to have the opportunity to just scream about it as much as I want.
I'm looking forward to it.
This was my first time kind of watching the dub, because I've seen it multiple times in the original Japanese, but for this I did watch some of the key episodes in the dub, and it was my first time, so that was pretty exciting, and I'm looking forward to talking about it.
Yeah, and the dub was produced in Calgary by Blue Water Studios. It's one of the few handful of notable shows that aired in Canada but never in the United States. And we also have one of the voice actors who worked on the show joining us today, Will Wood.
Yeah, hi. How's it going, everybody? If you've listened to Pretty Cure, you'd know me as the voice of Sean Ferguson. Oh, hey, Hannah. How's it going? Oh, Natalie, that's so cool. I think that's what he sounded like. I'm pretty sure I nailed that. I'm a voice actor, an improv comedian, a writer, a gamer. I like stuff and things. I live in Vancouver, and I'm happy to have you here. And I personally am a super Cure Pretty fan.
And Will, so of course you played Ferguson, who's a civilian character, which means that unfortunately you never once got to say Mipple while you were recording Pretty Cure.
No, but if I remember correctly, and it's been a while since I've seen the series, and I'm sure you guys can tell me if I'm wrong, but I feel like there was an episode where my character did actually get to see some of the crazy stuff that was happening. Or am I misremembering that? I feel like he did, and then like later on they were like, no, it's amnesia, or something like that. But I feel like he got to see it one time. But
I feel like there was one where he was like, "What? I think I saw something weird," and they were like, "Oh, it was just a dream. You passed out," or the usual Precure excuse when a civilian sees all the crazy stuff.
Yeah, no, I never got to say Mipple as that character, although we did do a lot of like background stuff. So I may have said the name. My voice at some point in the series may have said the name Mipple, but I don't know.
You heard it here first, folks.
I mean, I just said it now. I can say it as Fergie right now. Mipple. There you go.
We'll you know what?
If
nothing else, we will make sure that you have as many opportunities as possible to say Mipple throughout the course of this podcast, because we got to talk about Mipple.
I love Mipples, man. They're really important to me.
They're soft and squishy and yellow.
I like Mipples too. If we're being honest.
Mipple is yellow, Mipple is pink. There we go.
Oh, that's right. I got them mixed up.
Nipples are usually pink. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I've already forgotten.
Well, not usually. They're all different. Anyway.
So yes, Pretty Cure, massive sprawling franchise in Japan. It is, one of those franchises where there is a new one every single year. It starts every February. And it is also a Toei production, and it's been kind of notorious for not being available for most of the time that it's been running in Japan, with a few exceptions. That's finally changed now, because starting just a few weeks ago, Toei has finally made the latest Pretty Cure season, Healin' Good Pretty Cure, available on Crunchyroll in Canada and the US, although I don't think you can watch, you still can't access the first 12 episodes.
They're working on that, from what I hear.
Yeah, you have to start at episode 13, and I believe a la mode was made available in its entirety in some European countries.
Yes.
Yeah,
that is correct.
So the tide may finally be turning on that, and we may finally have better access to Pretty Cure. But this dub that aired on YTV was one of the rare instances where there was an attempt to localize Pretty Cure in North America. And I don't think that's how many of us discovered the series, but let's start off just by talking about how we were introduced to Pretty Cure. I'll just chime in first. The franchise is something I was aware of since it started, but something I never really looked into through most of that time. I was excited when I found out that, this Calgary-produced dub was going to air on YTV back in 2009. That's mainly because at this point in time, this is when anime was kind of declining on YTV. And when it debuted, which was March 6th, 2009, that was just a little less than a year after The Bionics block was pretty much put out to pasture. They moved it to Saturdays, which was kind of like the death knell on that. And I was really hoping that Pretty Cure would be a hit and could revitalize anime on the channel. And unfortunately, that absolutely didn't.
I was hoping for that too.
Yeah, unfortunately, it did not happen. Despite the excitement, and despite the fact that I was really excited for it, I was never actually able to watch it live because it always aired in time slots that were specifically times that were convenient for children, but not convenient for anyone else, which made sense because Pretty Cure is very much a show for young children. And so it aired usually early in the morning or after school. And I didn't go out of my way to record it or anything because I just assumed that surely there would be many opportunities in the future to watch this dub legally. But
surely, yes.
But unfortunately, to this day, the only legal way there has ever been to watch the English dub of Futari wa Pretty Cure in North America has been the YTV broadcast. It did air in the UK about a year and a half later on the Sony-owned FreeSat channel called Pop Girl, which no longer exists. But that is it. Apart from those two broadcasts, it has never been released on home video. It has never been made available streaming. It is currently just sitting in the Toei vault, side by side with the Ocean dub of Dragon Ball Kai. And I hope we'll see it again in some form. But it doesn't seem that Toei wants that to be the case right now, which they can be like that sometimes. Okay, Eryn, can you share your Pretty Cure story with us?
Well, obviously I've just generally been into magical girls for a long time. I've got the standard Sailor Moon YTV story that I've told on the podcast before. So Pretty Cure is something I've always been aware of. I think I most directly started to get interested in it when I was really big into anime music specifically. I had an anime music podcast back in the day that thankfully nobody will probably be able to find anymore. But there were a lot of Precure MP3s in the places I used to go hunt for anime music. And so I got into it through the music first, and that's why I feel so strongly about the opening theme, which I'm going to talk about later, is the fact that it slaps just on its own without even knowing what the show is, and that's the case for a lot of Pretty Cure music. And I was curious about the show, obviously, after a while, after having just listened to the opening themes out of context. So eventually I finally decided, okay, I should watch some Pretty Cure. I'm not sure which one, though, because there are a million of them. And I ended up settling on Yes 5 Pretty Cure as my first, because that was the first of the Sentai-style team ones, and that seemed to be the default mode for Pretty Cure, so I thought, okay, maybe I'll start there. And that was a good decision. It's not a perfect show, but it is a cute little show that has that same strong sort of focus on female friendship that is appealing to me about magical girls as a whole. Characters caught my attention, and it ended pretty strongly, so I was like, okay. So I continued from there. I watched a few more things. I watched Fresh Pretty Cure, which I agree also slaps. And I actually still have not watched all of the original Futari wa Pretty Cure. I've watched the first 10 episodes, mostly dubbed, actually, because I was interested in it for the video I was doing last year. And then some scattered episodes afterwards. And I do intend to get back to the rest of it someday.
I may be biased, but that dub is great.
That dub is pretty great. I'm definitely going to get back to the rest of the original Futari wa at some point, because when I had started watching it for that video that I did, I was commissioned from my Patreon to review a specific episode for that show. It was episode 14. And I decided I'll watch a little bit of the show to get some context for that one episode. And I meant to only watch a couple, but I ended up, like I said, watching the first 10 because it was that, just compelling. You could watch it like popping popcorn. Yeah, and that's kind of where I'm at now. I've watched a few more Pretty Cures since, and I'm still learning stuff about the franchise, and yeah.
Pike, why don't we talk to you next? How did you discover Pretty Cure? What is your Pretty Cure story?
Pretty is one of those things that I've been kind of aware of for a little while, just because I had friends who would, usually the typical story was they'd be like, oh, what's this thing about magical girls? And then that would be like the only thing they would talk about suddenly for like the next year. So it seems like a very addictive kind of thing, and I only kind of heard about it from fan circles. I am your Yank guest from the South, so we did not have it here on TV, and I started watching it pretty much actually after my girlfriend and I got together. She said, like, I have this anime I want to show you, and I said, okay. And she said it's called Fresh Pretty Cure. And I said, oh yeah, Pretty Cure, I think I've heard of that, but I've never, watched it or anything. And so we watched it together. It's like one of her favorite anime. And I fell in love with it. I thought that it was great. I just loved everything about it. And not to go on a huge tangent, but Fresh had like a really neat like redemption arc, and like it was really kind of surprising how interesting it was to me as a kid's show. So I was like, oh my god, that's so great, I want to watch more of this. So we went on to the next one we watched was Kira Precure a la Mode, which at the time had just finished airing. We watched that, and again, I loved it, and at that point I was so sold. I was like, I'm gonna watch all the Precure now. I'm gonna go back to the very beginning and watch it all. And so that was kind of the story of how I got into Pretty Cure. Was then I went back to the beginning, which of course is the first season, Futari wa Pretty Cure, which we're gonna be talking about. And I just kind of remember after the end of Max Heart, which is the sequel season to Futari wa Pretty Cure, it was ending, and I just had this kind of like sadness of like, oh, we're never gonna see these characters again. I'm so sad. Because I'd just gotten so attached to the characters, and, spoiler alert, because they are the first, kind of the, senpai Pretty Cures, they actually do come back on occasion as for, like, special events, so, which makes me very happy. But, I went on to, watch all the other Precures, and, I love Precure as a whole, as a franchise, but the first one was just really special to me for a variety of reasons. Mostly the characters I just thought were just so well done, and of course the action and everything about it was just really neat to me. And since then I have kind of been slightly obsessed, and that is my Pretty Cure story.
The first show is just, it's so simple but so charming.
Yeah, and it's, I think a lot of it too comes down to how the first Pretty Cure was about two girls. That's why it's called Futari wa. The two of us are, Pretty Cure. And Precure would later start to move toward like a more like a Sentai style, like here's a 5-girl team or a 6-girl team, kind of, and that's also obviously been very popular, so, cause that's their usual formula now. But there is something about just the two girls together that just really, I think, really drew me in.
Okay. Will, why don't we, get your story in too?
Sure. This may or may not surprise anybody, but my introduction to Pretty Cure was when I received some audition sides for this show that was called Pretty Cure, and I was like, oh, what's this? This looks interesting. And as I do with anything that I get auditions for, especially if it's a dub of a Japanese show that already exists versus like a prelay series of like a new cartoon that's being produced at the time, I immediately, as an actor and as a general fan of things, will go and start researching everything about it. And if my character that I'm auditioning for already exists, I will go and listen to the original Japanese character to like, just to try, like, obviously when you're dubbing stuff in English, you're not often trying to just like do an English version of whatever the Japanese original is necessarily. I mean, you want to keep intent and stuff like that, but I like to just like absorb it and see all that kind of stuff and who the character is and look them up and everything. So that was my introduction to Pretty Cure, was like, and I remember my first thought was like, oh, so it's like Sailor Moon. 'Cause it's like magical girl stuff, and I didn't know how big the magical girl phenomenon was at the time back in 2009, especially because the internet wasn't quite what it is now and all that kind of stuff. But I was looking into it and all that kind of stuff, and then as the time has gone by, and I've obviously seen the show since I've been in it, and have seen that the show definitely goes well beyond ththose first 2 seasons, because you said Max Heart is like basically the second season of Futari wa Pretty Cure, right? It still centers on the two main characters of Nagisa and Honoka, or Natalie and Hannah in English. And I remember at the time, because I think even in 2009, like the show had advanced beyond like the first couple of seasons, and looking back, and I'm looking at it right now too, and I'd seen it over the years, but yeah, it's striking how, because I'm like looking at an image right now of all of the different Kiers together, and like Natalie and Hannah, or you know, their Japanese names, but I know them as that because I was in the dub, obviously. They stand out from every other character, like just like it's so ridiculous how different they look from everybody else, because every other Kier, it looks like, I haven't seen the shows afterwards, but it seems to me like all of them basically, like you said, like a Sentai thing where they're all basically one color scheme. They have the same color hair as their outfit and everything, whereas the two in the original, to me, are the only ones who look like sort of regular people, if that makes sense. So and you had said that that those two come back later on, and I was kind of curious because I don't know, because I haven't seen it, just from what I looked at. Like, does everything moving beyond that, is it all like, obviously they wouldn't be like referencing a lot of stuff, but is it like an actual continuity? Like, does everything that happened in the first two seasons like exist in that world moving forward? Is it all?
Well, it's like a weird, reset? Fuzzy, timey-wimey, canony wannony kind of thing. Basically, every separate Pretty Cure series is its own universe, more or less, but there are crossover movies where all of them get together.
Okay.
So it's kind of, it's almost like there's two sets of continuity, one where everyone is separate and one where they're all together.
Okay, so to me, I'm just going to, in my head, say that this is like different versions of the Ninja Turtles, but then there's a couple specials where they cross over their different universes.
Yeah, exactly. It's like that.
That's pretty cool. I always kind of compare it to, I don't know if anyone has played Final Fantasy, but kind of every Final Fantasy game is kind of its own universe, but they all have some similar elements. Like, they've all got, like, Moogles and Chocobos and, you know, whatever. And it's very similar with Pretty Cure, whereas, you know, every season has kind of, you know, they've all got the little, you know, fairy companions, they've all got, you know, toys that they're trying to sell, kind of, and they've all got, you know, kind of similar elements, but they're also all in their own little universe, kind of. But they will they'll do like an All-Stars where suddenly everyone is together and they kind of hand wave it as, oh yeah, they're all together now, and, you know, it's just an excuse to get them all on screen.
So here's a question then, based on Final Fantasy, which I'm a huge fan of, like I'm a big gamer, but how many mobile Pretty Cure games with a bunch of microtransactions are there where you can get all the different characters and gacha style elements? That must exist, right?
It existed. I put 300 hours into it, and it ended about a month or two ago, and I'm very sad about that. So
pour one out for Cure Poos.
Pour one out for the Pretty Cure puzzle game, which I played religiously and collected all my favorites, which I still have on my phone because I feel sad about deleting it. So yes.
So in the community, is it like what I mentioned there? Because like I said, when I'm looking at the picture of all, like, I don't know if this is all of them, but at the time that this image was created, like, am I alone in thinking that like the two originals like definitely like stand out, like you can pick them out immediately, or is that just because I know them? But it just looks like they don't really belong with the rest of the group, honestly.
Oh, absolutely. I feel like, and the character design, I feel, for their costumes especially is also very different because especially one of the things I really like about the originals is that, you know, instead of like kind of like, oh, we're magical girls, we have like high heels, they're like, oh no, we got boots, we're gonna stomp you in the face. And this was actually intentional from the director, who said that he wanted to make a show that showed that girls could stand on their own 2 feet without any outside aid, and so their flat kind of boots made for stomping are meant to kind of show that. And in later seasons, I think they kind of went into, you know, overboard with the pretty kind of dress up, and they've got heels now, the outfits are frillier, and not to say that getting kicked in the face with heels isn't gonna hurt, but I do really appreciate just the more grounded, very physical, weighty style of the original character design. And yeah, the fact that they don't have like, you know, pink hair or just crazy colors, you know, it's
It's all very practical. Like, it's the boots, it's the like gloves that are made for punching. It's the fact that like they have like bike shorts under their skirts, so there's like no like possible way you could get a fan service shot of them or anything. Which, it's the shoulder pads. Gotcha. It's everything.
I know when Pretty Cure first started airing, the way people would always describe it would be that it's similar to Sailor Moon, but instead of using like magic attacks, they just kick and punch everyone. It is worth noting that there is lots of kicking and punching in Sailor Moon, but most people don't realize that because it was edited out of the Deke dub. But yeah, that whole focus on girls standing on their own 2 feet and putting the focus on battling, that's because Toei was looking for like a different direction to go with their 8:30 a.m. girls time slot. So they basically own this time slot on TV Asahi, 8:30 a.m. every Sunday. And it's a time slot that's traditionally targeted at young girls. And it's worth emphasizing, and Eryn especially I think can back me up on this, that time slots are very important in Japan.
Extremely so. Has been since the beginning.
Time slots are just as important now.
Too.
Mm-hmm.
They're less important. Now, like in Japan, the time slot you're in is just as important now as it was in 1967.
It's all streaming here in the West. So.
Yeah. When Pretty Cure aired in Canada, a lot of people made a big deal about the fact that for at least part of its run, the time slot kept moving around, which is an indication both that it wasn't doing very well, but also that, YTV was trying to give the show a chance. You definitely can't deny that they tried to make it work. But for a period of time on YTV, they were running Pretty Cure on weekdays at 3:30 p.m., which famously, that's when they ran Sailor Moon when it first debuted. And a lot of people make a big deal out of the fact that the time slot that Sailor Moon ran at is a big reason why it was able to be such a success here, because it's just the perfect time for kids to watch after school. Royal Canadian Air Farce made a joke about Sailor Moon in one of their episodes, and they made sure to point out that time slot in their joke, which I thought was kind of funny, even though the segment is not really that funny. But yeah, in Japan, time slot is everything. And Toei Animation basically owns that 8:30 a.m. time slot on TV Asahi, and over the years it's been home to basically girl-targeted shows. They've had stuff like Marmalade Boy, everyone's non-problematic fave Hanayori Dango, and other stuff, and Ojamajo Doremi, which 4Kids released here as Magical Doremi in the early 2000s, had that time slot for several years. When it ended, they replaced it with a show called Ashita no Naja, which is kind of a historical fiction kind of show, kind of similar to Candy Candy. I haven't seen that one myself, so I can't comment on it, but it was regarded as a big failure in its time slot and ran for 1 year. So they kind of went back to the drawing board with what they wanted to do next. And they hired on a new producer, or not a new producer, but Takashi Washio to sort of come up with a new direction to go with the girl-targeted time slot. I did bring up one interview with him. I had to run it through Google Translate, but he said something to the effect of, I asked if I could make an animation with a different taste, and that was kind of what he implemented into Pretty Cure. And again, the initial proposal for this series was making a show where girls were able to stand on their own 2 feet, and he said it would be cool if, like Kikaider, our old Sentai shows that he liked when he was a child, if they would fight together, but like a girl's version of that. And he wanted to get rid of that barrier of what type of show you'd watch if you're a boy or a girl. And that is why they got Daisuke Nishio, who was the director for a significant portion of Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, and also directed Interstellar 4-5, if you're not aware. He got on board, and they very much saw eye to eye on that, and wanted to develop a show where it would be unthinkable to need a male character to come and help the girls, where it would be cool if they could just always solve it on their own strength. He also mentioned that, they wanted something similar to Sailor Moon, but he in that interview he commented that Sailor Moon at that time in the early 2000s was regarded as a show that you couldn't do anymore. and I've always found that attitude kind of interesting because it seems that every time they try to do, we've been in constant state of Sailor Moon revival for like a decade now. But
it's been the 25th anniversary of Sailor Moon for, 5 years now?
Something like that, yeah. But Sailor Moon revival is something that's always targeted at nostalgic adults, compared to, say, Dragon Ball, which is always primarily targeted at kids. So I find it interesting that...
I'm a nostalgic adult when it comes to Dragon Ball.
Yeah.
Well, you're still important, but you're not as important as the kids on that.
I get that a lot.
But yeah, there's always this feeling that you need to do it differently than how you did Sailor Moon. And I personally, I have speculation that the act of localizing Sailor Moon S and Super is because Toei actually, unlike the first part of Sailor Moon, which was handled by DiC, Toei actually did those seasons themselves. And I think that may have influenced kind of Pretty Cure from the ground up. Because when Toei makes a kid show, they have two ways of doing it. They could do it with an international audience in mind, which is how they handle things like Dragon Ball Super or Digimon, or they can do it with only a domestic audience in mind. They had their recent Gegege no Kitaro series. It was very much, when they made that, they were not worrying about international audiences at all and do all the weird things that you can't do in other countries. Pretty Cure, when I watch it, and I watched the whole first series to prepare for this podcast, it really comes off as a series that was made with an international audience in mind. That's kind of the impression I got. Which makes it kind of funny because it has such a storied history of not being distributed internationally. I think Italy and Germany got it shortly after it aired in Japan, but...
Well, Italy gets everything.
Yeah.
Italy gets everything.
Latin America also got it at some point. I'm not sure exactly when. But...
Yeah.
So can I ask, because I haven't seen anything past basically the stuff that I've been in, but I get the impression just by looking at it that everything that comes after the original series with the original two characters, not only do they obviously look very different, but I get the impression just by looking at it that the whole tone and feel of the show would be very different from the first season. Like in the following series that show up, are the main characters like still going to high school and worrying about high school dances and stuff like that, or is it like I don't know, like is it similar in concept? Or
I'm actually curious because I haven't seen much of it, how like just more about the franchise in Japan and how it's evolved both during the original series and beyond.
I would say for the most part, actually, it does still maintain a pretty good balance of like slice of life school kids and the fight scenes. So for that, as far as that's concerned, I think it actually has remained pretty consistent. The characters for the most part are all in middle school. They're usually around 14 years old. Occasionally they'll have a younger Cure or a really cool, like an older, like a 17-year-old Cure. They have those every so often. But for the most part, it does maintain its kind of roots as a story about, middle school kids who have a secret kind of superhero life. So that actually has stayed pretty consistent through the years.
Yeah, no, you'll get mild tonal differences for different series, but for the most part, it's fairly consistent, and it's always this focus on the girls' school lives and their friendships with each other and relationships with people in their lives and how they can help them out with their magical girl kicking and punching powers.
So do they have, because I know like Natalie and Hannah in the original series, they don't have like obviously it's anime, but like their hair colors are more, for lack of a better term, like more normal to real life kind of thing. Whereas when you see all the pictures of the other ones, they have like really striking, vibrant hair colors. Is that like what everybody in the school looks like in those series, or is that like is their hair color?
No, it's still very much main character syndrome. Although I will say, for the way that it started to be after the initial few series, it started to be where the civilian identities of the Cures would have more subdued hair, and their hair would actually change and become more lavish as they transform.
My favorite in that regard is actually in Doki Doki Precure, where the main character Mana, her civilian form, she has pink hair, but then her super Precure hair is just blonde. I always thought that was so funny.
So she goes from a more unusual hair color to
Super
less one.
Yeah. And I always just thought that was funny, because it just seems like the reverse of, they start with a more mundane hair color, but then, their super form, they get like bright hot pink, and she kind of went the opposite route, and I just thought that was so funny.
Like, can you actually describe Futari wa Pretty Cure, just the plot in a nutshell?
It's about this main character named Shoujo Fujimura.
Yeah.
And
he
is the star of the show. It revolves around him. Anyway.
And there just happen to be these like weird explosions every now and then. Who knows what's up with that?
Yeah, there's there's incidental events that happen like on the side, but it's really about him and his soccer practice.
And I think one time maybe there was a monster, but maybe he dreamed it, and that's the exciting episode.
Yeah, I think he saw a snowman move one time, and that was pretty exciting. Anyway.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, basically, the plot of the show is, and it's pretty simple because it is it's a show for kids. It's about two girls, Nagisa and Honoka, or Natalie and Hannah, depending on whether you're watching the dub or the sub, who go to the same middle school, and they don't really know each other because they're into completely different things. Nagisa is more sporty and outgoing, whereas Honoka is more, I wouldn't really say she's shy, but she's kind of like a science geek kind of, and she's just not really interested in talking to people so much as she is about like reading her textbook kind of. Yeah,
she's very studious and, but kind of elegant too, so they contrast each other in that sense.
Yeah. And, basically they each, through different circumstances, find, mysterious fairies who come from another world, the Garden of Light, and they happen to kind of be able to turn into flip phones, which I think in retrospect is kind of weird, but like after you've watched a show for a while, you're like, oh yeah, that's fine. They're flip phones.
Excuse me, I think you'll find they're called card communes.
True. They are called card communes.
Well, the original Japanese was produced in like 2004, 2005, right?
2004, yeah.
So this was the height of emerging technology.
That was cutting edge, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's something halfway between a flip phone and a compact, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's something halfway between a Motorola Razr and a Yu-Gi-Oh card, personally. But
yeah. They do have cards, which I find interesting, because I feel like, that kind of, I don't know if you guys remember, kind of at the turn of the century when everything was suddenly about like card games, like Yu-Gi-Oh! And so I kind of feel like they were kind of playing on that a little, like, oh, we'll throw in cards because why not?
It's a toy.
Like Toei has always been hawking a toy.
They transform using toys.
Yeah, exactly. So they're like, we could sell, collector cards. But yeah. So anyway, they can use the cards to basically they hold hands, swipe the card through the commune, and are able to transform into the legendary warriors Precure, Densetsu no Senshi Precure, and which gives them kind of superhuman strength. They can jump really high. They gain they gain some superpowers, magical powers, but those are mostly used as finishing moves. The bulk of their fighting is done through punching, kicking, lots and lots of action. And basically the plot is they're trying to save the fairies world from the Dark King, who's kind of just the big bad who wants to destroy everything because he's the big bad. And so basically it's the plot follows them kind of, it's like a slice of life kind of mixed in with like a monster of the week kind of, because the bad guys can summon monsters called zakenas, which are kind of just various objects that come to life and fight and are always really silly, kind of like they had like a vacuum cleaner monster and stuff like that.
They always say Zakena, right? Like they're
they only say their own name.
They only
like
say
a Pokemon.
Until they're destroyed, at which point they turn into millions of little stars and say, "Go in, I'm sorry."
Well, in the English they say Zakena too, don't they, when they run away?
They say Gomena even in
English. They say Gomena even in English, which I thought was interesting.
Do they? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But the rest of the time they just say Zakena. But yeah, basically the show kind of is just, it's about the two girls becoming better friends, which I think is actually done in a really realistic way, because they aren't friends right away. It takes them 8 episodes to actually call each other by their first name in the original Japanese version, which in the dub is they kind of do it in a cute way where Honoka is allowed to call Nagisa or Natalie by her nickname Nat, which I thought was a cute localization.
It really is.
Yeah, and so I thought that was a really cute way of doing that, and yeah, that's kind of the show, is these two girls happen to have superpowers, they become the best of friends, they beat up bad guys, they save the day. It's kind of a bittersweet ending, because the fairies do kind of, I guess, spoiler alert, they do go away at the end, but they also come back immediately at the very beginning of the sequel season, so it's not, like, really a sad ending.
Which aired the week after it.
Yeah, and they had been Toei had been playing ads for it, like, on TV for, like, months, so everybody knew it wasn't actually the end, so it's it's fine.
The show's plot kind of gets a little bit more, like, serialized as it goes on, too, right? Where there's sort of a bit more of an overarching thing that it leads up to.
Yeah, it's actually very interesting, because, and from what I understand, and someone can correct me if they know better and I'm wrong, but from what I understand, when they first started making the show, they didn't know if it was going to last beyond half a year, beyond like 26 episodes. So if you actually sit down and watch, the entire show, it'll feel like there's an arc that's ending like halfway through the show. It kind of feels like a false ending, like, oh, we did it, we saved everybody, we're done being Precure, and then the next episode is like, oh, just kidding, there's like another kind of, he came back, and it's because it ended up being so successful that they were like, oh my god, we can like actually stretch this out for over a year. So it does kind of have that interesting, like, kind of a restart halfway through, which feels a little weird without the context, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't actually know what the deal was behind the scenes on that, because typically the shows in that time slot usually ran for at least a year, but I think there was a kind of a perceived risk with Pretty Cure, so that would make sense if there was that.
Yeah, especially if their last show went down the toilet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. So that does make sense.
I don't remember specifically all the plot details because I haven't seen the show since like it first came out, but I know that there's 3 sort of planes of existence, right? There's like the Garden of Light, which is where the creatures and the Pretty Cure powers come from, and then there's the Garden of Rainbows, which is like Earth, right? Like that's like where
exactly.
we live.
Garden of Rainbows is trapped in the middle between
and
the
then
two.
It's Garden.
Yeah, or it's like Midgard
Darkness,
if we're talking like Thor terms, maybe.
Yeah. Is it called the Garden of Darkness? It's the third one, or
I believe it's just called the Dark Zone.
The Dark Zone.
Yeah,
the Dark Zone.
Yeah,
right.
it's the odd.
And that's where all the
creatures
come. And then if I remember correctly, there's like 3 characters that like leave the Dark Zone and like end up on Earth, like in the Garden of Rainbows, and there's like some subplot with them like trying to like take over the Dark Zone or like fight against the Dark Zone. If I remember
that's
correctly.
mainly in the second half.
Mm-hmm.
What I found interesting in Pretty Cure is that, as we pointed out, they resolve the plot of the first half, and then they essentially hit the reset button and then start almost the same plot over again in the second half, but it's done in a more interesting way. The first half of Pretty Cure, I think it might be the most formulaic magical girl show I've watched. I haven't watched, honestly, like that many of them, but it's very straightforward. You have, there's 4 generals, and they're kind of going through each of them one at a time over the course of a few episodes. They each summon a monster in each episode, and then they just kind of keep progressing until they get to the Dark Lord in the end, then defeat him. But then, surprise, he's not dead. There are 3 new generals who, instead of going one at a time, they're all working together throughout the season. And, it leads to that plot where they're trying to stage a coup and take down the Dark King, essentially. So, same idea in that second half, but it's changing it up a little bit, doing things in a little more of a complicated way compared to the first half. So, the first Futari Pretty Cure, it very much feels like they're trying to find a footing of how to structure the show most efficiently. That's kind of the impression I got, at least.
I think that makes a lot of sense as well, because there are certainly also a lot of artifacts in the first half of the series of the fact that they didn't really have a full, like, understanding, say, of, like, what the Cure's abilities are necessarily, or, like, how everything was going to proceed going forward. Like, they show certain powers that never get used again, even though they probably would be pretty useful, honestly. just because not everything was set in stone at that point.
Yeah, I think it is kind of very much, it's a little rough around the edges, and certain things that come up are kind of like, you don't really see them very often, or they're dropped. Like, for example, one of the earlier episodes, they actually have a move called, I believe it's called Pretty Cure Rainbow Therapy, where they could, like, purify someone, and it was like, the first time I was watching it, I was like, oh, that's where the cure in Pretty Cure comes from, because they actually have a cure move, but then they, like, never use it again, or they, like, use it, like, once.
And the cure part of Pretty Cure would never be relevant
basically.
Again until Healin' Good.
Yep, and then it, like...
They're not carrying big syringes around or anything like that.
No, so it just kind of, and, I think that's kind of part of the charm for me, is that it is kind of rough, and they're still kind of trying to find their feet with it. But definitely, if you kind of go in for it looking for either like a really deep story or like something like really polished, you're not really gonna find that, because they were I think they were still kind of trying to figure out, well, we have our idea of let's make, kind of a show where girls can, fight Dragon Ball Z style, and we're still kind of trying to figure out, what we're doing with that. It's actually kind of interesting to compare to the later, more modern seasons in that way.
Yeah. You know what they did have nailed down from the start, though, was the characters, especially the two core characters. And that really is the appeal that made the show so big, just because, like, I said this in a video that I made a little while ago, about Pretty Cure, but really, the fact that there are only 2 of them, and they didn't add any more, like, until basically Max Heart, means that they had to be absolutely sure that these 2 characters who you were going to see for the whole show had to be compelling. They had to be watchable. And I feel like there's a lot of really good Precure series after this, but it seems like some characters, because the casts are larger, kind of get the short shrift because they're just there to kind of fill out the group and they don't get as many standout moments as they could. Whereas this, you see both main characters in pretty much every episode. They build off each other, in terms of like building their friendship and learning more about each other and learning more about themselves. And you really feel that bond building throughout the series.
Yeah, and I appreciate that what they did is they actually, I think they took some character tropes and kind of subverted them a little bit with the 2 main characters, Nagisa and Honoka, because I have introduced the show to many people because I don't shut up about it, and they eventually watch it because of me. And usually one of the first things a lot of them will say is, I went in and I thought this was going to be, kind of a basic, you have the ganky pink girl and the, kind of shy, like, more elegant, white or blue girl. And to an extent that's true, but if you actually watch the show, it's really interesting because Nagisa, your main lead, who is your sporty heroine, is really kind of very grounded and down to earth, almost to the point of pessimism, which I feel like you don't see in a lot of, especially the more modern Precures where they tend to make the main characters very bubbly, very upbeat. And Nagisa, or Natalie, is so much more, she just feels more grounded, she worries a lot, the beginning of almost every episode, she's like, I can't believe this is happening, that's literally her catchphrase, Ari and I, this is impossible, this cannot possibly be happening. And Honoka is, whereas even though she's like, her character is supposed to be, she's like a really smart scientist. She's so idealistic and dreamy. And it's almost like the reverse of the, Kirk and Spock trope from Star Trek, where you have, the scientist is the dreamy one. She's the idealist. She's the optimist. And your kind of sporty girl is actually the one kind of holding her back almost. And I love that dynamic. I feel like you don't really see that type of thing a lot. And that's, I think, one of the things that really draws me to Futari wa Precure more than the other seasons is because they do kind of, I think, subvert some common anime tropes in that way.
Mm-hmm. And it's also interesting the fact that, like, this is, like you were saying, this is like the most formulaic magical girl show you could ever imagine. And it's full of, like, all the tropes you would expect, all the frills, all the pink, all the monsters of the week, everything, floofles and rainbows and everything. There's literally an attack called Rainbow Storm. Mm-hmm. But the two leads, while they are part of this like super feminine power duo, it comes back to that ethos of girls standing on their own 2 feet, and their femininity is not what defines them. It is their can-do attitude, and also the fact that they have like fully like non-feminine interests and personality traits as well. Like we have like a jock and a scientist, neither of which are thought to be traditionally feminine character tropes.
Absolutely. Yeah, I really just love how they did that. I think that's just, the characters really, really, really make the show to me.
Yeah, I was going to say also, just looking at them from like a character design perspective, there's something like unique about the way that they're designed, because I'm kind of like, as a writer and stuff like that, I'm into like the design and the creation of characters like as they stand. And again, like that picture I was talking about, where you see those two with all the other Kiers mixed in, like they also stand out from a design perspective, not just like their color scheme and stuff like that, but they're almost like designed to be like a duo to stand together in the first place. Like that's why when you look at them with all the rest of them, those two also stand out as like those two are there together, where everybody else, and again, because I don't know the other shows and stuff like that, but since they're larger groups and they all kind of, everything past those two have sort of the same kind of color design scheme and stuff like that. It like you don't really see those two as individual, like you see them together as like a duo, as a team, and it seems like from the very design perspective, they're designed to complement each other in that specific way that you don't see in the other character designs, which is really unique and cool.
Yeah,
and there's also sorry, you go ahead first, Pike.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I do love that, and you actually see that in a lot of, like, fan art, where people will, like, they'll have, like, all the lead Kiers in a lineup, but they can't really decide on a lead Kier from Futari because they complement each other, so they're both there. And I always just love that. It's like they're a package deal. I just think that's great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the only other show that even kind of comes close is the only other duo show, which is Pretty Cure Splash Star. But even in that case, vague spoilers for that show, I guess, there are other people who join their team later on in the show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they've, Precure has kind of experimented with the duo format. They did with, Mahou Shoujo Pretty Cure a few years back, but again, that was also, we'll add a 6th Ranger kind of halfway through
they
thing.
chickened out on that one. They did the 2-person duo format for that one, and it worked for a while, but they couldn't stay away from it. They had to add a 3rd Ranger later on in the show.
Yep. And that just I think that's just their thing now, is I think they've kind of made their move toward larger casts, which I think does work in, a lot of situations. But for me, just the original idea of 2 girls will always just be kind of special to me. Yeah.
Yeah, just in terms of maintaining interest, I can see the logistics of it, just because having more characters means having more avenues for coming up with weekly stories. But it really does hamper the bond between each individual character and their friendship and whatnot. Maybe
it's just the case of the fact that they nailed it the first time, so couldn't improve.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the basis of the success, because I guess there was just kind of a bit of a fatigue going in how they would handle these girls' properties on the Sunday morning time slot that really sent them back to the drawing board, just to figure out, at the most fundamental level, what do we need to do to make a successful property that they own? Also, it's important to note that I think that Pretty Cure was made in partnership with Nakayoshi Magazine, because there's always a Pretty Cure manga spin-off in there, but it is owned wholly by Toei Animation, and they obviously very much wanted to have their own franchise that they could have there. I think it's kind of understandable that it keeps kind of going into the direction of having a team or a Sentai set up, because this show airs back-to-back with Super Sentai and Kamen Rider in Japan, and they there's a lot of crossover in the marketing of those shows in Japan as well. Like, if you go to any Asian grocery store, just like even in Canada, look at often they're going to have like curry for kids, and you're going to have on one box, you're going to have the current Super Sentai, you're going to have the current Kamen Rider on the other, you're going to have the current Pretty Cure on the next one. And they also usually have a minion one too, but we don't need to talk about that.
And it seems like it's kind of become like the Barbie and Hot Wheels.
Yeah, I just
yeah. Oh, they've had crossovers too. It's really fun.
Yeah, recently there was a video that was produced, I think, for one of the big Super Sentai crossover things that they did recently, where the story didn't cross over with Pretty Cure, but they had a special ending credit sequence where they had the CG models from Pretty Cure come and do a dance number with all the Sentai characters.
It's important to note these theatrical movies that, they're non-canon, as we've talked about. And when Toei does these movies, they like to cross over
just like
things
the Dragon Ball Z movies.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Perfect. That's the perfect analogy, because none of those the old Dragon Ball movies, the new ones are different, but the old ones don't fit into the continuity anymore. They're just released into theaters packaged with a bunch of other films, and it's just a standalone thing. The same thing with these Pretty Cure movies. It is important to note, though, that these Pretty Cure movies are usually released as double features with Super Sentai movies as well. Mm-hmm. They usually air back-to-back in theaters, same audience for them. So and there's a lot of crossover.
Film and then a live-action Sentai film?
Yeah, exactly.
That's
cool. There's a lot of heavy crossover between those, and it also gives boys the perfect excuse to watch Pretty Cure, because they can just say that they were waiting for Kamen Rider to come on right after too. So
yeah, and I like that they didn't really try to make that excuse for it for the first series. That they specifically said they wanted to make something that both girls and boys could enjoy, and that ethos is on display.
Yeah.
I also said this in the video that I made last year. But the specific episode that I looked at for that video focused a lot on in-universe fandom for the Pretty Cures, and they made sure to include both girls and boys in that audience in a very standout kind of way.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's getting better, but I don't mean to make this whatever, but it sucks to me that oh, you need an excuse to watch something like Pretty Cure. I'm a 34-year-old man, and I love Steven Universe, and that show is not. Well, that show is kind of made for me in a way, a little bit, but I don't know, man. I just hate the world how it's always oh, you have to, not to get into gender roles and all that kind of thing, but it's just like what you like, and why do you have to defend it and excuse
I think it's important that Pretty Cure from the ground up was made to challenge that kind of mentality. It's quite the fight, and at the end of the day, marketing's gonna complicate things. But I think it's a really important component to Pretty Cure, with crossover appeal. And I know there's a whole brony element with Pretty Cure in Japan as well.
Well, you were saying that it's as big as Sonic the Hedgehog over there, right? It's up there with that.
It's huge.
Yeah.
I have a Sonic and Knuckles tattoo on my arm. And,
oh, nice.
And I would love to live in a world where I could have a Pretty Cure tattoo on my arm, but that would be a world where the series went more in my care, and I had more of a part of it. But I think it's really cool to hear about all this and how cool it is, and just to know that even though it didn't really go anywhere here, that it's reflecting on it now. Not that I didn't feel this way before, but I don't know, it's just really cool that I got to be some part of it, apparently of the best part of that show. So
exactly.
And I do have to say, I watched the dub when it came out, and I listened to everything that video games, anime, whatever. I'm a dub person, and I was before I got into it too. It's there's a little bit of I'm in the industry, but I just prefer listening to things in my own language, because it's easier to absorb stuff for me. And dubs have gotten a lot better over the last I didn't really watch much stuff back when dubs were notoriously bad, but and then I revisited a little bit too before this podcast, and I gotta say it has nothing to do with me, because I still find it, because that was one of my first shows, and I still kind of find it sort of weird listening to myself in the show, but I feel the dub for Pretty Cure is it's awesome. It is a good dub.
It's so
great.
Good.
I really like it.
It is good.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I guess this is where we transfer into talking about the dub itself.
We absolutely, yeah. So when I watched the series specifically to prepare for the podcast, because I only seen a few random episodes on YTV before. So it's important to note this dub was produced by Toei directly. They didn't sub-license it to Deke or another company like that. And it was sent, of course, to Blue Water in Calgary, that's where the actors were located. However, the director, Carl Willems, is based in Vancouver. He's he's directed most of your favorite ocean dubs. He was directing this, and so Will, are you able to? I know you can't talk too much about the production, but can you just comment on how that kind of worked in this context with this show or possibly other shows that kind of went that way?
Yeah, I mean, I worked with Carl on a few different shows. Carl's a great director. I always loved working with him. Whenever I did work with him, it was always when I was in either Calgary or Edmonton. Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly what programs and stuff were used or whatever, but like when I was in the booth in the studio, there would be like the engineer on the other side of the glass, and then Carl would be patched in, and he would direct me, directly over headphones while we were doing the recordings. And yeah, it was a pretty smooth process, and even though it was all remotely directed, it never really felt that way, because it was all like, one-to-one directly patched in, and it was a pretty cool process. It wasn't really any different than working with any other director in the booth, aside from the fact that like I could only hear him and not see him. But there's a lot of productions, even when it is done in the same building, where the booth will be isolated and I won't see whoever's directing anyway. So.
And important to note, this was 11 years ago, and the sort of remote collaboration between like the Ocean Studios and Blue Water, it's only gone more in that direction since. So it's neat to hear that it was such a smooth process even back then, when I think the remote approach was probably a kind of a newer thing as well.
Yeah, and I mean, we didn't even have a pandemic back then, so like, we didn't have to. Not to date. Now I've just dated this episode for you, but
no. We have.
But every podcast I've ever listened to in the last 6 months, has to date it a little bit, because it is sort of a giant piece of our shared history. So
for sure,
absolutely.
I wish someone would pretty cure this plague. Yes, okay.
Yeah.
I had to get that out of my system.
That's okay. Yeah, also script adaptation was by Paul Baldwin and Michelle Clough, also based in Vancouver. So again, very much a kind of a collaborative production between both of those studios. So it's worth noting that as a localization, the Pretty Cure dub is incredibly faithful to the original. I actually the version I watched of this. I don't usually advocate piracy on this show, but come on, we're talking about Pretty Cure here. And piracy has been crucial to following it for many,
many years. How else do you
years.
think the Western fandom for Pretty Cure has survived?
I actually watched
What's piracy? I've never heard of this.
So I actually watched bilingual DVD rips. They take the Japanese DVD and they just make two audio tracks. You have the Japanese audio track and you have the English audio track at another level. That only works if the dub doesn't remove any footage and it's just 1-to-1. This dub is almost 1-to-1 with the original. You can take that dub, just paste it right on the DVD from Japan, and it fits almost perfectly.
I've watched an episode that way, and yeah, I didn't. It's
completely seamless.
Perfect, so.
Yeah.
Of course, my name doesn't show up in the credits of that version, but whatever.
Yeah. Well, it's all in Japanese anyway, so no one's gonna. Yeah. And all the rips floating around are online, are taken from YTV broadcast. I think there's maybe a couple clips taken from the Pop Girl broadcast in the UK, but almost all the rips are straight from YTV. So if they ever skip anything like a next episode preview, which they, inconsistently do sometimes, that's basically lost forever. And I will say I did identify in YTV's broadcast there was one edit in the series. It was a scene in episode 29 when Natalie is trying to wave down a car. I noticed when I was watching the bilingual rip that it suddenly turned to Japanese for like 2 seconds. And I suspect that this cut was made by YTV because they didn't like the idea of a kid waving down a random car to come help them. And there was a bad guy in that car, as it turned out. So maybe, I don't know.
Interesting. It seems pretty tame to me, but... who knows?
Interesting that would be the cut, yeah.
I mean, YTV made a fair number of edits to shows in Bionics. They were always really weirdly inconsistent and sloppy. It was very rare for them to make any kind of change to shows that are targeted to younger audiences, though, because I think, generally when you get content for a younger audience, you're just going to assume it's okay and throw it on, and it almost always is. But yeah, I'm pretty confident. It seemed like a YTV cut when I went through it. In retrospect, it's very disappointing that they did that, because that broadcast is the only version of this dub available anywhere, and that little clip is like gone forever, and that one cut kind of it's the one blemish on these bilingual rips. But yeah, that's
yeah.
But apart from that one thing, it's almost exactly the same. They also remove vocal songs for the insert songs. There's a few of those throughout the show. Although the lyrics are removed, but the background music is still the same. And of course, they changed the opening theme as well. I know that there's some various opinions on it. The new opening they recorded is completely different from the opening in the Japanese version. I know a lot of people like the dub opening. I am really not a fan, especially since I watched the version I watched had the Japanese music intact. What did you guys have an opinion on the dub opening?
No, you're 100% in the right. The original opening is iconic, and every other dub localization of the series in other countries has used a version of that opening. I believe the English dub is the only one that doesn't, and it's worse off for it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting to me because, I mean, I think that the opening song is a banger, and most people I've talked to agree, and I know a lot of Precure fans online from other countries that got a dub, like, Germany or Italy. They got their own dub of that song with just the same melody, everything. They just, translated the lyrics, and they all love the opening too. Like, everybody in every language loves this opening, but for some reason for this dub, they're just like, no, we're gonna throw that away. Bring in a new one.
I'm not gonna comment on, not that I could anyway, about anything about why that would be or whatever, but I will just say, like, from just a general, like, perspective, as like somebody who watches stuff and a fan of things and other anime and stuff like that, like, I agree the opening theme, the Japanese original, is it slaps, man. And honest, and the closing credits theme, like, not even like the theme's cool too, but I love the little animation of them. It's just so weird and wacky in Japanese of all the people just like marching in front of like the classroom setting. Not, I also particularly like the fact that my character leads one of those lines, but which would make you think that he's way more important to the show than he is, but he's not.
I mean, he's technically in every episode in that sense.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, actually, I was just looking on my credits on IMDb, like, cause I don't put that stuff there. I don't know who puts that stuff there. Obviously production people or whatever, but and I know that it's not always super accurate, but I was noticing for my credit for Sean Ferguson, the English version of that character, it lists me on 4 episodes, but I'm pretty certain I was in a lot more than 4 episodes.
Oh, for
sure.
Oh,
definitely.
Oh, yeah.
56 episode run, but
yeah.
It may be, I don't know what that is or anyway, but and obviously I did like incidental characters here and there too. I remember one character I did who was in the English, I think he was called Mario Piccolini, and he was like he was the character who
he was the painter, right?
Yeah. And,
I think I watched that episode.
The
painter
original.
The one girl in the class is obsessed with him, and
he was the shooting star, and the painter or whatever was actually Mipple or whatever coming down and hitting him in the face with it. And that I remember because I enjoyed doing the recording for that, doing all the like kind of sounds. I don't know if I spiked that or not. I actually have that in my animation demo for stuff that I've been in, but anyway, so I did like little characters and stuff like that, and like and background stuff. But yeah, the opening and closing themes. Having said that, like I don't dislike the English opening theme. I think it's a perfectly serviceable and good theme, and I think it's cool in its own right. And I also like the way the credit version just does an instrumental version of that. But I mean, I do, and like if you look at like Dragon Ball Z and Super. When they came out with Kai and then Super, like if you look at the original Dragon Ball Z, based on whether you're talking about Canada or America, because obviously there was 2 different dubs, the original like Japanese theme is so much better, and I love the way nowadays, like I think if Pretty Cure came out now, I think they would do it because it's like a different mindset now.
Yeah.
But now pretty much any anime that comes out will be either an English lyrical adaptation of the original theme, or a lot of times they'll just keep the original Japanese theme with the Japanese lyrics as well.
Yeah, because they know that kids know what anime is now. Like, technically, they even kind of knew in 2008, 2009. Like, Inuyasha came out before then.
But I will say, in one case, if you look at, like, Pokemon, which was obviously done by 4Kids, and it's very well known that they did that adaptation in like the intent of this is not an anime. They tried to make it seem like this is an American cartoon. Like, that was their intent behind it. And everybody loves the Pokemon anime, and I think a lot of people like the original dub, the original 4Kids with the original actors, I think in a lot of cases. Same with Dragon Ball Z, where in a lot of cases the dub is actually preferred over the Japanese original for most people anyway. But that is one case where the English-American theme, I know it has nothing to do with Pretty Cure, but the English-American theme to the original Pokemon is far superior than the Japanese original theme, which is cool too. I like the Japanese original theme, but so every now and then they do hit it out of the park with a localized American theme. But
for sure. But in 2009, even then, it was unusual to replace a theme, or it would not have been unusual to maintain like the original Japanese theme or do just an English version of the Japanese theme. And given the way everything else was handled in the dub, I'm kind of surprised that they went that route. I can't even begin to speculate on why. I will point out, though, that there's one episode in the show where the ending theme plays a role in the plot. And watching that episode, it's episode 44, I think is what I have in my notes. You can tell that they actually did dub a version of the ending theme, because it's used in there. You only hear it playing through a tinny radio for a small portion of it, so you don't even get to hear the whole thing. But they play enough of it that you know that an actual adaptation of that song was done. It had to have been done to do that.
The closing theme or the
opening? Of the closing
theme. And I've found the full translated lyrics to it online, and it's great.
It's a fantastic
really
translation.
Translation.
Nailed it.
It's so well done.
Yeah.
And so that kind of also shocks me further that they didn't try the opening theme, because I was like, clearly whoever was translating that ending theme was great. You know, it's just kind of, I don't know why they didn't try the opening theme.
I want to live in the alternate universe now where we got, not only just for the theme, but where we got them marching around in front of the chalkboard.
Yeah.
I love that. And
although that might have been covered by YTV idents and whatnot anyway.
True, but if I could have my name on that scene, like my name scrolling by on that scene, that would be super cool.
It does make me wonder if they dubbed a version of the opening as well and just wasn't used. I'm kind of hoping maybe one day Toei will loosen up and like let Discotech put this series out, and turns out that those recordings are still sitting somewhere and they can mux the whole thing together on a DVD or Blu-ray. I think that would be very cool, but it's extremely unlikely, unfortunately.
I
would love to own a Blu-ray set of this series.
Oh.
Yeah.
I would sell my soul for like a Blu-ray with all new, subtitles, and it would just like, I would immediately, that would be like a day one pre-order. But because if you want to legally watch Futari while Pretty Cure, it's on Crunchyroll, and for some reason it looks like a VHS rip.
Yeah.
Is it the dub
and
or
the
is it just
subtitles.
Or is it just subbed?
Yeah.
And
it's just subbed.
Oh.
And it's not even a good sub job for some reason. It's just like, just throwing it out there, the fan subs are better if you're gonna watch it subbed. And so it's just really weird to me. And so that would be like, that's my pipe dream for the series, is that we get like a DVD or at least a better version.
Let me tell you, as a voice actor, it's disappointing that I can't own like a DVD or Blu-ray set of everything that I've been in. Like I own one DVD set of a show that I've been in, the first show I was in, and that's the original Hunter x Hunter, not the new modern one. But well, it's not even that modern now, but like the original one from like 1999 that we did in like 2007, I think. And I do own that on like a DVD box set, which is really cool. But none of the other shows. I do have a toy of my character from Scan to Go, but again, like, so many of these shows that just didn't, well, I guess that happens to a lot of anime. There's just no like release for them outside of the initial broadcast, and it's sad, but
it seems to happen.
I don't know.
It happens to Canadian dubs like disproportionately too, I find.
And also specifically to the kid like specific ones as well.
Yeah. So again, in terms of localization, what I found really kind of peculiar about the dub is that it never in any way denies or undermines the fact that the show is set in Japan. But it always, every single time they have a chance of openly acknowledging it, it always just falls short of explicitly stating that this show is set in Japan. I don't know if it was a choice or it was like Toei telling them, you can't set this in Japan, but they just still brought it as close as they could without acknowledging it. I found that interesting. And you can consistently
these sure are some
see
good
that.
donuts.
Yeah, and the food, oh god, the food localization is honestly hilarious in this show.
Did they do that? Did they do the whole like rice balls but call it donuts?
Literally not rice balls, but okonomiyaki.
Takoyaki, they have decided, is now
well,
donuts.
that looks a little bit more like donuts than the friggin' rice balls from Pokemon, right?
They do.
You can get what kind of looks like Timbits, right? So
yeah, I think fritter would have been a better
they should,
better
since it's a
or
Canadian
even just
show,
like a
they should have just called them Timbits.
Yeah. No, someone on my Twitter
honestly,
timeline actually brought that up the other day, and they posted that. They posted that clip of him calling it donuts and said they dubbed it in Canada. Why didn't they call it Timbits?
Well, I mean, honestly, that I can give a little bit of insight there. With most productions and stuff that I've been, well, pretty much everything. Like if we're even though we're Canadian, they're Canadian productions. We're always doing it for a general North American / American audience. So you try not to have like you may have like honestly. The years of being in the booth and doing stuff have actually trained me to sound way more like an American than a Canadian anyway. And I've noticed little things like if you've ever, like I've said sorry a few times on this podcast already, and I definitely don't say it sorry like a Canadian would. And I hear it every time a Canadian says like sorry instead of sorry. And things like where we say out, well, not we, where Americans say out, including me, instead of like out and stuff like that. So, so the dub, a lot of that kind of stuff is specifically like it's pretty much just an industry standard to just do it in an American, like a standard American pronunciation way.
You're forced to become aware of these things that the rest of us would never really think about in the way we speak.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I like it's just all that stuff has just become the way I talk. Like I don't even think about it. Like I've had a lot of my American friends and stuff are like, "Whoa, you're Canadian?" That's I've had a lot of people say that I don't sound like a typical Canadian. So
yeah,
I do spell theater R-E instead of E-R. But
yes, I'm very particular about keeping the R-Es.
Yeah.
But I do not put U's in like color and armor and stuff. No way.
Yeah.
But that has nothing to do with acting. I just wasted effort. Anyway.
The food localizations are really funny. Interestingly, in a later episode, they call yukatas summer kimonos, which is not localizing it in any way, but it's calling it something that I guess they thought kids would grasp better. I don't understand that decision.
Yeah, like kids know what a kimono is, but maybe they don't know what a yukata is.
Yeah, like maybe they took some kind of survey or something to come to that. Again, I don't know how much of this was Toei and how much of this was Blue Water. Given that we talked a little about Glitter Force, which is the Saban-produced localization for some of the later Pretty Cure shows that you can find on Netflix. They outright removed any episodes that had like Japanese cultural elements that they couldn't easily erase. Again, I don't know how much of that would have been Saban or Toei's call, but it's interesting that there's that contrast in the localization process for how Japanese they're allowed to make it. There is one episode of the dub that I think kind of goes too far in erasing or obscuring that. Yeah, and that's Honoko's grandmother basically talking about growing up during World War II, and you have this very obvious post-bombing World War II footage that is like shamelessly grifting Grave of the Fireflies in its aesthetic. It is so incredibly obviously supposed to be this World War II setting, and they change it to be the aftermath of an earthquake. And I guess I can kind of understand why they went with that change, but I think that was a bad decision. I don't think they should have localized it that way. I don't think it would have been that big a deal to keep it the way it was. I don't know whose call it was, whether it was Toei or the scriptwriters or the director or what, but yeah, that was one point where I think they made the wrong choice for sure.
Yeah, but it might have been like a rock and a hard place kind of situation if it was from the studio, like, you can't acknowledge that this is Japan, but they're also not going to cut anything, but there's also this very, like, Japanese imagery that they can't avoid, so I understand why they would choose that, but it's still, like, feels bad.
Yeah.
Feels bad, man.
Yeah, and it's especially... Cause I've seen the original, the Japanese version of this show multiple times, and, going into this podcast, I picked maybe 10 or so episodes that I watched the dub of, and that was one of them. And I also had the version where you could flip the audio, track at will and turn on the subtitles when you wanted. And so I was comparing the subtitles on that scene, and it definitely changed the mood of that scene, and especially because she gets to the top of the hill, because the story is, her father used to take her to the top of this hill to look over the city and see the beautiful sights. And so after this, bombing, or in the dub it was an earthquake, she takes these other kids to the top of the hill and just sees rubble. And it's really interesting because in the dub they changed it to her being shocked, almost what happened? I can't believe this. Whereas in the original, the subtitles, she looks over and she kind of has this I don't know what I expected moment where she says liar under her breath, as though because her dad told her you'll always see something beautiful, and she looked over and just saw the city flattened, and she just said liar, and that was all she said. And it was just a really powerful moment in the original that by kind of changing that, it really did kind of change the tone of that whole kind of that story that she was telling, which I found really interesting.
I mean, compared to, say, the Glitter Force approach, which definitely would have just cut that episode entirely.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it wasn't just a localization choice. It completely changed the intention of that whole scene. So that really didn't work. I think that's definitely the low point of this adaptation. But it's really just that one scene that I thought was handled badly. I can't say that about really anything else in the series. It's very rare that, and I was watching, for the record, I was watching this English dub with the subtitles on, just because I wanted to get a comparison. It was incredibly rare that the script would ever go seriously off track from what was happening in the Japanese. I know in episode 3 there was a scene where these guys encounter Hannah and Natalie, and they're very clearly trying to hit on them, and the dub changes that to just generically picking on them in a way that doesn't make any sense and doesn't match the visuals. Mm-hmm. That was really the only other scene I noticed where it was kind of going against what was happening in the original. But
Well, there's also the fact that they, whenever in the first episode and afterwards, when they mention Honoka is popular with the boys, but Nagisa's popular with the girls, they definitely didn't say that in the dub.
They toned that down quite a bit. I feel I kind of feel like the original Futari wa Pretty Cure was kind of designed with a sort of, if you want to wear Yuri goggles, you can, kind of in mind, and they had FujiP in there for plausible deniability, but they definitely kind of, when they,
which we're all
when
very
they brought
grateful
them to
for,
the West,
that
they were
FujiP
no,
exists anyway.
We are definitely, this is a very heterosexual show, it's kind of...
They're best friends, Pike. I don't know what you're talking
best
about.
Friends.
Best friends.
Doesn't matter that they have an official set of figures where they're both in wedding dresses together and clearly getting married.
Which I own because I'm a complete piece of shipping trash. I'll just throw that out there. But yeah.
The Romeo and Juliet episode was pretty much unscathed in terms of that.
That's true.
Yeah.
That was very and they had a lot of scenes like that, which I actually thought the dub actually made stronger. And one of the examples of that I can think of is in episode 42, which is my favorite Precure episode of all time, which is the one where they're separated.
Yeah,
and,
that was a really good one, yeah.
They have to find, or specifically, Nagisa or Natalie has to find Honoka or Hana, and there's just a part in there where I think the dub actually did it better, which is they were playing, Nagisa had kind of given up, and she and Meppel were playing Shiritori, or the word game, where they're, naming words and then using the last letter to come up with a new word. And in the original, they were just kind of naming random words until Nagisa thought of the word Honoka. And in the dub, they changed it so all the words that Nagisa or Natalie was saying were related to her feelings to Hana, about how she was smart, how she was sensitive, how she was intelligent, how she was her friend. And that I was not expecting it, but it really hit me, because I was like, they literally took my favorite episode of anime ever and somehow made it better. I was really impressed.
Yeah, they did a really
praise
good job
indeed.
Of that,
yeah. If I'm saying the dub is better in Futari while Pretty Cure, that is very high praise, because I love the original.
What did you think of Fujimura in the dub of Ferguson? I'm just asking for a friend.
Absolutely great. 10 out of 10.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah, great. Almost.
No, honestly, I don't know. I've never really gotten any. I mean, I know he's not an overly important character to the show, although he is overly important to Hana. To Natalie. I mean.
Yeah.
So I don't know how it whatever, it's not what this is about, but I'm just curious, because I've really gotten a lot of feedback, especially from honestly, an adult perspective, because when I hear myself, especially since it's one of my earlier works, I'm pretty good at hearing myself and stuff now, and I'm not saying that I think I did a bad job or anything, but to me, I just have this memory, and I think it flashes back because it was the first anime on network TV that I ever heard myself in. It wasn't the first one I ever did, but it was the first one that aired on TV that I heard myself in. And I had this back in 2009 when I heard it. It was like this weird thing in my head where I would listen to the whole episode. Everybody else sounded so great and professional, just like any other thing I would watch. And then it came to me, and it felt like in my own head, the whole thing just broke down at that point and became this low budget thing where I just heard myself speaking out of it, and it didn't fit with everything else. And I feel like just having that memory of it for that particular show and that particular character just always flashes that back to me. But I assume for everybody else, it just sounds like it belongs.
You pretty much catch the exact vibe of the original character.
Yeah, I will be very honest. The original character was not that compelling. He was put in basically, like I said earlier, to be plausible deniability. So you could say, oh no, it's obviously it's not a show about two girls holding hands because one of them has a crush on this, guy. And so I actually genuinely think that, doing that character would have been difficult, and I'm not a voice actor, but I mean, if they told me to do, FujiP, I would have been but he has no personality. No offense, but I would have found that difficult, and I genuinely think from what I saw, I think you did a good job of trying to, kind of take this character that really was not really a major character and try and make him kind of a sympathetic character.
There's a sweetness to the way that you played him, honestly.
Yeah, for sure.
And it really comes across, especially in the Christmas episode.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like you probably didn't have a whole lot to work with there, and I think you did good, so.
Well, thank you. I got a lot of comments back then that was the first character that I played in something where they're like, wow, that doesn't even sound like you, so. I don't know, because I guess I don't typically sound like a 16-year-old kid, so. But I can still do it as a 34-year-old man, and that is important for the resume. So,
a couple other things I just wanted that stood out to me in the dub that I thought were kind of funny. Going back to the whole donuts thing, they added, so they really seem to have a lot of fun with Regina, who's one of the Dark Zone generals in the second half of the series, and the whole gag with her is that she's usually very quiet and demure, but then when people press her, she just kind of starts yelling what she really thinks. And they gave her this obsession with donuts, as if to take the whole takoyaki donut thing even further, because there's this scene where Alex is the name of the girl who runs the takoyaki stand in the dub. I can't remember what her name is in the Japanese version.
Akane
/ Alex, where the two basically just have a short exchange, and apparently she eats some of the donuts, and they add dialogue later where she's telling the others about the donuts and how they're so great. And it really seemed like the dub played with her a little bit. They made her say some really weird things at some point, but it was pretty funny. I thought that was a weird touch.
I saw that too in one of the episodes where she was just, she kind of started screaming about donuts. And I was just like, I don't know where this came from. It wasn't in the original.
It was not, no.
The other, probably the other thing that made the biggest impression on me about the dub, that I found, like, as far as, like, things I thought were kind of unusual choices, maybe, was in the episode with the dog, Futari, kind of adopting a puppy.
I was gonna mention that one next.
They added so much extra dialogue, and they kind of changed Futari from being like he wasn't really, like, serious in the original, but he was a little more, like, he was, like, the cool older dog, and they kind of turned him into comic relief, gave him, like, twice as many lines, and another interesting thing
They made him very sassy.
Yeah. They made him very sassy, and another interesting thing was it wasn't even just the dog. That whole episode, there were, like, flashbacks to previous episodes that in the original were completely silent, that suddenly had, like, a voiceover of Natalie, like, kind of explaining, what had happened, which, again, I found kind of an interesting choice. And I know that's kind of a, I think that's kind of a Western dub thing, is they like to throw in extra dialogue. So it might have just been that, but I just found that very interesting. That
as long as there's no lip flaps, it's fair game.
Oh yeah, exactly. It was a flashback. No one was talking. They could have her say like a million things,
It's not as bad as like 90s Spider-Man cartoon where everyone has to be talking at all times. It can't stop.
Yeah,
but
it was really bad in Card Captors as well. They added so much extra dialogue, wall-to-wall dialogue for Card Captors.
But it just that episode in particular, because a lot of the other episodes I'd seen were, as we've said, were very faithful. I'm quite impressed. And then suddenly, for some reason, that episode, they were like, we're going to make the dog talk twice as much, and the silent flashbacks are suddenly going to have all this, exposition. And it was just, it kind of seemed to me like it was like, oh, for this episode, they just kind of went all out with the voice work, I guess.
Yeah, I wonder if it was just like wondering if the kids would be confused when the dog started talking midway through the episode or something. Like, that seemed to be the only reason for it.
I mean, that was kind of a weird directorial choice to begin with.
Yeah.
To be fair.
It kind of was.
Yeah. I mean, in the original version, to have him start talking halfway through. So, also.
Yeah, it did come kind of out of nowhere.
Yeah,
so I can understand that choice, but it's still like the choices for the extra dialogue that they did add.
Yeah.
are certainly not quite the feel of the original.
It was like, oh, the dog has no lip flaps. Finally, we're free. We can do whatever we want. That's kind of almost.
They also give Futari a line in another episode too, just out of nowhere. I can't remember which episode it is, but he just he just barks out a line, and I'm just like, what? And then that's all you hear of that. But it was
If anything, that would be more confusing for kids.
Yeah.
Yeah. They obviously had fun with that. So I can respect. No,
it is still fun.
Yeah, I didn't think it was, like, bad. I just thought it was kind of funny. It was like, suddenly here's this episode where there's, like, twice as much dialogue, and I was like, it worked. It was just kind of funny to me. I wasn't really expecting it.
But I think, as we've all made pretty clear, I think we all really like this dub. I think it's a strong dub overall. I'm really glad I watched the whole thing, and I wasn't expecting to want more when I finished it, but I gotta say, I'm really disappointed that there's no dub for Max Heart, which is the direct sequel to this series. I really wish they had just pushed that through. I kind of wish, as unlikely as it is, that they'd go back and actually dub it again, or rather get at least some of the cast back to do it, because Toei still sends things to Blue Water now and again. So I mean, I guess it's not completely impossible, just highly unlikely.
Well, who knows in this post-legal Pretty Cure stream world.
That's true. all of a sudden we're getting, legal streaming Pretty Cure.
Glitter Force is dead. I mean, I know that people have been declaring Glitter Force dead since before it even started, but it actually is dead now. I think Toei is trying more different localization approaches for the franchise now. So who knows? Maybe they'll make this dub available. Maybe they'll go back and dub more. For the most part, I think I would just really want to hear the two principal characters or the two principal actors back, because they give this really strong performances, very distinct performances.
Rocio and Michelle are they nail it. Like they kill it. They crush it in this. Like
Rocio Barahona, who does Natalie, she is so distinct with
She's
the
my
voice
favorite
that she
part
gives
of the
that
whole
character.
show, honestly.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
And I was really, really, I feel like, not to sound like an elitist, but like going in, I was kind of dubious because these are like my two favorite characters in anything. I love their original Japanese voices so much, and I really wasn't sure going in. And for a few minutes I was like, but then they grew on me so fast. And now I'm just like, they actually did a really fantastic job, and I'm really impressed.
Yeah, and honestly, me not having as much of an attachment to the original Japanese when I started watching it, I was watching both the sub and the dub for comparison's sake for that video that I made, and I ended up wanting to watch the dub more as I watched more episodes, and I had the sub on for less and less time.
Yeah, they just really nailed the characters. Overall, I would say it was a really good dub, and obviously it had a few missteps which we've discussed, like the war episode, but I think overall it was very faithful, and I really do think the voice actors did a great job with it.
Mm-hmm.
If they could bring it back with at least those two leads, I think it would be great. Maybe I wouldn't be as enthusiastic if they weren't both there.
Maybe that one guy who did Fergie.
Yeah, you know,
we can get a hold of him.
Well, I looked up, way back when we were doing it, I looked up the stuff that goes forward, and so there's the Max Heart series, and I believe there's one or maybe two films as well that happen in that canonicity, and I think in one of the films there's a character that is clearly based, it's not Ferguson or Fujimura, but it's like a fantasy Prince version of him, and I was like, oh man, I hope I get to play this character, but it has not yet happened. But this role and this show will always, even though it didn't really go anywhere, maybe someday it will, but it'll always be super special and important to me. So, and having this discussion and being part of this discussion just reinforces that. So, I think it's really cool that there were at least some people in Canada who really cared about this show, and that even on the broader global scale and in Japan and stuff, this particular version of the show is considered one of the fan favorites. And so, like I said, just for me, it's really cool to know that I got to be even a small part of that in some way. So
yeah. And certainly there were people who aren't even Pretty Cure fans or the Japanese Pretty Cure fans, who watched that original dub on YTV, and I was looking through comments on the dub opening theme from people saying oh, I remember this. Oh, this was my first anime. Oh, this is so nostalgic. So it definitely did reach some kids.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I'm pretty active with the Pretty Cure fandom on Twitter, and I see it all the time I'll post pictures of my merch, or I'll retweet someone's fan art or whatever, and there is always in the comments there are people saying, oh, I loved this show when I was a kid. I totally forgot about it. And it's just, it's wild to me because I didn't have that when I was a kid, that it's oh yeah, there were people who actually had that as a kid. That's so cool. And they're still out there, and they still have such positive memories of this show. And it's really neat to me.
I will say one thing real quick, if either of you know, or anybody in the communities know, or wherever you post this podcast, because I assume this podcast will be posted in all of those places that you were mentioning. So if you know, or you know anybody, or anybody listening to this knows, and I'm sure it probably doesn't, it won't exist officially, but if anybody on Etsy or anything like that, if there's ever been official or even unofficial, a figure, a toy or a character of Shogo Fujimura or Sean Ferguson has ever existed, please somebody let me know about it, because I want to own it. So
I'm pretty sure it does. They have a lot of Precure merch of really obscure, like, side characters, so that only show up in one episode, so I'm sure it exists somewhere.
At the very least, he's gotta have his own, like, Prism Connect card or something like that.
Yeah, he's got something. Yeah.
Yeah. Just in regards to the reception that it had on YTV, this is something I kind of wanted to get a feel for before I recorded the episode, because as I kind of touched on before, this show moved around a lot on YTV. They always put it in time slots that were for children or, like, quote unquote for girls, or slots where girls would watch more frequently. And they had become very fickle about that kind of thing by, like, 2009. So I think it started airing, like, Sunday mornings, it moved to weekday mornings, then it moved to, again, the quote-unquote Sailor Moon time slot, weekdays at 3:30 p.m. And it went on very long hiatuses a lot of the time, too. And then they actually wound up burning off the final 5 episodes in a marathon on July 10th, 2010. So the show debuted March 6th, 2009. So this was dragged out for actually quite a long time. You know, I get the impression that they certainly weren't setting this up for failure. I think they really wanted it to succeed and be a thing. But I mean, the cold hard truth is it seems it just wasn't a rating success. That's very clear from the way it was treated. And I don't think you can deny that. So there's a perception that this was a, kind of a flop or a failure on YTV. So, I was just kind of curious, and I'm not involved in the Pretty Cure fandom, so I don't hear people talk about it a lot. So I was just curious, and I went around to different Facebook groups for conventions around Canada, because that's where you're going to find the highest concentration of Canadian anime fans for the most part. And I just posted and I said, hey, I'm recording a podcast for this show this weekend on Pretty Cure, and I was curious who here actually watched this show as a kid, remembers it from when they were watching YTV, because I just assumed that anyone who was able to catch this on TV would have been a kid, just due to the way it was scheduled, because I was not able to catch it in its time slots at all. They were very much kid time slots and not adult nerd time slots. And I gotta say, I was very surprised by the response. There were a lot of people who remembered the show, a lot of people who got into anime because of the show, a lot of people have a very deep attachment to seeing it on YTV. It just shows that just because something was not a broad success in a conventional, like, rating sense, you're always going to find anecdotes of people who it was significant for. And that was a little eye-opening for me doing last-minute research for this episode, I've got to say. And like what you said, Pike, I'm actually now not surprised that you've seen so many fans talking about, seeing it as kids. And I'm just curious if you guys had any other thoughts on, why this might not have been a ratings or more conventional success than it was.
It's really interesting to me, because from what I've seen is that, from what I understand, Toei tried in the beginning, for the first few years of Pretty Cure, they really tried to push Pretty Cure to the West, and they had, like, a website, that was obviously not directed at the public, but at, trying to sell this show to networks. They had trailers for not just Futari wa Pretty Cure, but for the first, 3 or 4 seasons of Pretty Cure, they made English language trailers for it.
There was a Canadian-produced Splash Star trailer.
There were, and they had trailers up through Yes Precure 5, which was the one that came after Splash Star, at least up through then. They still have a huge Pretty Cure section on there. If you go to Toei Animation's USA website, they've got links to Digimon and Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon, and then they've got a link to Pretty Cure with all the English information and English translated logos and plot synopses. And it really feels like they really tried for the first few years, and for whatever reason, it just didn't catch on. And I think some of it might have to do with, kind of the lack of merchandise would be one of my thoughts. It's kind of a very toy-driven show. They work, closely with Bandai to sell toys. I
just talked about how I wanted to buy a toy from this show.
And I feel like, I just remember being a kid and getting into Dragon Ball Z, and there was like, at that time, there was like no Dragon Ball Z merch until one day we went to like a dollar store or something, and they had like a bootleg yo-yo with Goku's face on it, and I freaked out because I was like, oh my god, like it's a yo-yo with Goku on it, and it was like, a cheap bootleg or whatever, but it was, at the time, it was like, holy crap, you can actually get merch of this weird show on TV that I liked as a kid, and so I think that, maybe if kids had been able to go to the store and there had been Pretty Cure merch and they had been buying it, or that had, inspired them to get into the show, I think maybe it might have been more successful, but for some reason we didn't get any merch, really outside of Japan, so I don't know what that's about. It just kind of seems to me like they tried and it didn't quite work, so they were like, well, I guess that's that.
I was reading that, I don't know how, if this is actually accurate, but 4Kids, did they have the rights to it at some point, but sat on it? Or what? Wasn't there something going on with 4Kids very early on with Pretty Cure?
I feel like there was. I don't remember the exact specifics, but I feel like they were maybe like either interested in it or they were going to buy it and for some reason kind of backed out. Don't quote me on that, but yeah. I do feel like I read that somewhere. Yeah.
It also feels like something that somebody made up. It just kind of
true.
Spread.
Yeah, you never know.
Because they localized
people
Doremi.
make up stuff about 4Kids all the time.
Yeah.
That's true.
Most things you read about 4Kids are made up by people who have probably never even seen a 4Kids dub before.
Yeah.
Frankly, most memes around 4Kids are very obviously made by people who have no actual first-hand experience with things that company produced. It definitely feels like merchandise played a role in why this was never really able to take off properly in North America. I was going back to some old discussion that was going on back when the dub premiered, and one thing that was brought up constantly was that, well, this is airing in Canada now, but there's no merch. How can this, is this going to work? Because Pretty Cure is, it's based around merchandise. Merchandise is the whole reason it exists. Mm-hmm. So it might just be that Toei had tried to get merch deals off the ground, and it just, everything fell through, and they just, decided to throw the dub out as a test on YTV and see how it did, and unfortunately it didn't do well, because, as you mentioned, merch and the programming are, kind of mutually exclusive and required for success, and it didn't work out. But then again, there's no real merchandise for Glitter Force, as far as I know, and somehow that was it managed to be kind of a thing on Netflix for a while, at least. So
it's really interesting to me because there are people who got into Pretty Cure through Glitter Force. So it's like, just like there are people who got into Pretty Cure through the dub. And it's just kind of interesting to me that, it's like these people exist. And I think, that Toei and Crunchyroll have finally started to listen as of recent events. We're kind of notorious on Twitter, us Pretty Cure fans, for being very loud whenever Toei tweets and saying, where's Pretty Cure, and it's kind of become our joke, is this is their way of saying, okay, here's Pretty Cure, now you can shut up. But it's just, it is kind of interesting to me to just how many people out there, get into it through what are supposed like failed dubs. But there are fans, so it's just, they are out there, and I always thought that was interesting.
Yeah, probably even worth remembering that technically the original Sailor Moon dub was considered a failure in the United States, and look where that got them.
But then that's the whole thing. It wasn't just that Sailor Moon got good ratings in Canada that kind of kept that train going a little longer. The fact that the merch sold well
they did.
in Canada, and then Irwin, which is a Canadian-based company, took over the merch.
I know I had that merch.
That was a big component of it, and that was a major component that was missing with Pretty Cure. So
it might just be the fact that like the kids couldn't as easily continue the adventures in their play sessions as they could with Sailor Moon, where you had the dolls and you had the wands and whatnot and all that.
Yeah, that's really kind of the only, like, real thing I can think of as for why it didn't take off so well. is just, I think that it's easier for kids to stay invested in something when, they have the merch, or they can ask their parents, I want this for my birthday, or, it's just kind of, but without that, it just kind of ended up being, one of those shows that was, airing for a while, and then it was gone. And then you couldn't buy it on video anymore.
A show on TV, and it was also, like, the streaming revolution hadn't happened yet at that point, but it was still leading in that direction. Like, I know that I was definitely paying more attention to digital at that point. I know I'm not a kid, so that doesn't speak to the experiences of what kids were watching at that time, but I feel like that anime fans, at least, were not exactly paying as much attention to YTV at that time.
And on that note, I feel that, like, the comments I was reading on social media were really the tip of the iceberg for that kind of thing. So if you're listeners, if you're someone who discovered Pretty Cure on YTV and became a fan, or even if you discovered anime because of Pretty Cure, I really want to hear from you. I want to hear your story about that. If you can email me at zannencanada@gmail.com, or even just hit me up on Twitter @jbetteridge, or @zannencanada is my less used Twitter account for the show. I would really like to hear your story. So yeah, reach out if that does apply to you. Maybe we'll wrap up just talking a little about where the franchise sits now. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, the latest one, Healin' Good Pretty Cure, is finally on Crunchyroll, and I'm just curious, do you guys have any expectations for the franchise moving forward now that we've kind of overcome that hurdle more or less?
For me, it's kind of early on, so it's kind of hard to say. I do think I find it kind of hopeful that not only are we getting, North America is getting Healing Good, and Europe is getting Kira Precure a la mode, which I thought was interesting, because it's not just we're getting one season, but, like, also 2 seasons are now legally available. I mean, depending on where you live, but it seems to be a good omen for the future. Obviously, my personal preference would be, it'd be amazing if we got, like, remastered Blu-rays with all new subtitles, and, it would be awesome if they had, like, if they released a Blu-ray of Futari wa Pretty Cure with the dub as well. Mm-hmm. That would be really neat. And if we could eventually get, like, all the prior seasons, maybe streaming on Crunchyroll, would be really awesome. I think right now it's just kind of seeing where it goes. They're kind of gauging interest. It is a little difficult, I think, because the show is still geared very much toward 5-year-old kids, but most of the people watching it on Crunchyroll are probably older anime fans, so it's kind of a weird kind of in between, like, if they're going to sell merch, who are they selling the merch to, kind of. It does have several adult fans, obviously, but that's another hurdle that I think will be interesting to see what they do with that. But I'm kind of cautiously optimistic at this point, and it'll be really interesting just to see how that goes over the course of the next couple of years.
Yeah, like, I would certainly like to see it take the, I guess the way they handle Sentai and whatnot over stateside, just in terms of, like, having all the DVD releases, and maybe not having a whole lot of extras outside of that, but at least having those releases and having that availability and that respect for the material in those releases.
At the rate things are going right now, it seems like, it definitely has a future as something that teens or adults are more likely to watch, subtitled on Pretty Cure. But yeah, at the same time, while that's great and it's better than nothing, that kind of makes it feel like they've just given up on trying to get it to kids, which is unfortunate. But
yeah, it is really interesting. I would love to, like, just kind of be a fly on the wall and hear what their kind of reasoning is behind this, because I do kind of, it would not surprise me if they were kind of putting this out as kind of, to appease the fans of, like, those of us that don't shut up on their Twitter account. I'm guilty of this, I'm sorry, but, and so it kind of almost feels like they're like, okay, here you go, here's Pretty Cure, and it'll be interesting to see if they actually do anything beyond that, or if it's just kind of, this is their end game, is we'll put everything on Crunchyroll and then they'll be happy, or if they actually have any plans beyond that. I honestly genuinely think if they did if they brought back Precure to broadcasting in a time slot for kids, brought some merch over, did a high quality dub like they did with Futari wa, I genuinely think kids would love it. Like North American kids, I think they would absolutely love it. And I feel like it hasn't quite been given that chance, and I would love if it was given that chance. But even if we don't get that and we just get the streaming, hey, at least we have legal Pretty Cure now.
Yeah,
it's better than
it's
nothing.
better than nothing for sure.
Yeah, and this is something we say over and over and over again on this show, but broadcast is very important for this kind of thing. It really helps when it's not just streaming, because there's still lots of kids watch TV because their parents are like the demographic that's most likely to still have a cable subscription. So, and that's why there's still so many kids channels, and it's declining for sure, but it's still a really important component of that. So, yeah, but the thing is that Pretty Cure is it resets every year, every February. So there's always a new chance to kind of start from scratch. Well, thanks for coming on, everyone. Would each of you be willing to just share where with what you're up to right now and where people can find you online?
Yeah. So I mean, I do some other stuff. You can find the stuff that I've done online, like the other anime and stuff that I've done on like IMDb and stuff like that. You can find links to all of that on my website, which needs a lot of work, but it has the relevant information, which is just willjwood.com. Everything that I have is basically Will J. Wood, so Twitter is Will J. Wood. Instagram, it's the real Will J. Wood, because some other Will J. Wood took my Instagram account, but like every other platform I have is just Will J. Wood. Like I said, I'm still working. I nothing that I can really talk about right now, but I do other stuff. I do improv comedy. I'm writing things at the moment. I'm actually working on, hopefully by the end of this year, I'm working with a really cool artist, and we'll be able to launch my first webcomic series that I've written.
Ooh.
Which is pretty cool. It's I won't give too much away about it, but it is a female-led series, so it's been pretty cool to write a female lead. And I'm also working, or have been working for the past little while, on my own board game, so you might see stuff from that coming, and then just generally doing creative stuff. I also, if you want to follow me on Twitter again at Will J. Wood, or any of those platforms, I'm big into gaming, so you can see that kind of stuff and what I'm doing there. And yeah, generally I'm just, if anybody listening to this wants to ask me anything about Pretty Cure or voice acting or stuff like that, or just in general wants to hit me up, I'm totally cool to chat, within reason. So, yeah, like I said, just Will J. Wood pretty much everywhere, willjwood@gmail.com. It's luckily I have a fairly marketable name, and with the exception of Instagram, I run the gamut on Will J. Wood as a brand name. So. And
Pike?
I don't really do any thing big and fancy really. I'm on Twitter pretty regularly as Pikestaff, Pikestaff. Most of my time is spent yelling about Pretty Cure and how much I think Nagisa and Honoka should get married. Sometimes I talk about video games and the fact that I'm still playing World of Warcraft after all these years, but mostly it's just me screaming about Pretty Cure. I used to do a lot of long-form type blogging about video games and anime and that kind of stuff, but I kind of got lazy and haven't done that in a while. But if I ever get back to that, I'll probably also link that on my Twitter. So if you want to come scream about me with Pretty Cure, please feel free to hit me up. I love talking about it.
And Eryn?
Once again, I'm Eryn, also known as Eryn Cerise. You can find me on YouTube at Eryn Cerise, that's ErynCerise, and also on Twitter at the same name. And once again, you can check out Mahou Profile, A History of Magical Girls. I also have a new podcast of my own. I'm currently 3 episodes into a new role-playing game podcast called Super Idols RPG. We're playing the game Masks: A New Generation with a magical girl and idol twist. So you can listen to that at superidolsrpg.wordpress.com.
Great. And yeah, thanks for tuning in to zannencanada. I am your host, Jesse Betteridge. You can reach me on Twitter at jbetteridge or email zannencanada@gmail.com. Our theme song is by Ultraclystron, and you can find that on his album Packet Flood at ultraclystron.com. Please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever you use for podcasts. I also have a Ko-fi account, ko-fi.com/zannencanada. If you like what I do, you can just leave a quick donation there of $3, and it'll help a lot. Thanks for listening. See you again.
We are the best of friends. We are strong. Together we are pretty cure. We join together, set things right. Together we are pretty cure. Pretty cure.
Come on. Learning a new song will be hard work, but it would be a lot of fun to sing. What say you at least give it a listen?
Let's not decide until we hear it, okay?
La 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 la.
Homemade donuts! Get your homemade donuts right here! You want to try some on the house, ma'am?
No. Thanks.
How can you resist the temptation of free donuts?
Well, if you insist.
I hope you don't mind. The burner for my skillet went out, so I had to deep fry them.
I don't do trans fats.